Welcome back to Daily Gossip. I am your host, and today we are skipping the Hollywood drama and the celebrity breakups because the absolute most fascinating, jaw-dropping, and consequential tea being spilled right now ISN and Oppos. Tea happening on a red carpet. It is happening in the austere boardrooms of central banks, the high-stakes negotiation tables of the North American trade corridor, and the hushed corridors of global commerce. We are talking about the kind of gossip that moves trillion-dollar markets, rewires global supply chains, and determines the price of the food on your table and the gas in your car. If you are listening to this from London, Berlin, New York, or Los Angeles, grab your coffee or maybe pour yourself something stronger, because the story I am about to tell you is a masterclass in the absolute true physics of economic coercion. It is a story of how the loudest voice in the room was systematically, quietly, and ruthlessly outmaneuvered by the architecture of patience. Before we dive into the anatomy of what might be the greatest geopolitical miscalculation of the decade, I want to take a quick second to ask you to hit that subscribe button. If you appreciate deep dives that strip away the media noise and get to the absolute core of how the world actually works, subscribing to the channel is the best way to support us. It ensures you never miss out on the real stories shaping our lives, our economies, and our futures. We have a lot more premium, behind-the-scenes content coming your way, so join the community, hit subscribe, and let us get right into it. Let us set the scene. Imagine the spectacle. Donald Trump did exactly what Donald Trump has spent a lifetime doing. He weaponized the single most consequential trade agreement in North American history, taking a scheduled, utterly mundane legal review and transforming it into a live, televised hostage situation. With the flourish of a showman and the heavy hand of an economic nationalist, he slapped a 25% tariff wall across $155 billion worth of Canadian goods. He stood there and threatened to tear up KUSMA, the very deal that his own administration had signed and previously paraded in front of the cameras as one of the greatest, most triumphant trade victories in American history. And then he took it a step further. Standing outside the White House, with the world in Oppos' press hanging on to every syllable, he casually declared that Canada might simply not be worth negotiating with at all. You have to understand the gravity of this moment. This was not a diplomatic misunderstanding. This was not some procedural miscommunication buried in a subcommittee. And it certainly was not just a backroom pressure tactic whispered behind closed doors. This was a calculated, thundering act of structural economic coercion, broadcast in high definition to every boardroom, every central bank, every commodity exchange, and every manufacturing floor on the planet. The message was clear: bend the knee or we burn the house down. By the spring of 2026, the pressure was supposed to be absolute. The July 1st deadline for the KUSMA review was bearing down on the calendar like a runaway freight train on a locked track. The United States Trade Representative had already completed 2 full, highly publicized bilateral rounds of negotiations with Mexico. They had 2 more rounds explicitly scheduled for the summer. And they made it publicly and unambiguously clear that Canada was, in the Trade Representative and Oppos' own patronizing words, falling behind Mexico on trade discussions. Think about the sheer scale of what was being leveraged here. We are talking about the fundamental architecture of North American commerce. $700 billion in annual cross-border trade. We are talking about the deeply integrated, almost cellular supply chains of the automotive corridor. We are talking about the massive steel infrastructure of Ontario and Quebec. And perhaps most critically, we are talking about the energy pipelines feeding American refineries with a staggering 64% of their crude oil supply. Every single load-bearing pillar of that colossal economic system was being dragged to the edge of a cliff. And the man holding it there was grinning for the cameras. He had done this before, after all. The playbook was well worn. It had worked in the past, pushing adversaries and allies alike into frantic last-minute concessions. Every historical precedent, every instinct of the Washington political class, suggested that it would absolutely work again. But here is where the story pivots from a predictable political drama into a profound psychological and economic thriller. Because before we get to how Mark Carney and the Canadian government responded, we have to strip away the noise, the theater, and the political performance to understand what this situation actually reveals about the true nature of power. We need to look at why this aggressive, overwhelming, and structurally confident move was simultaneously the most catastrophic miscalculation made since the very first tariff letter left the Oval Office. The fallout from this event is compounding by the hour, and the clock is still ticking. So let us examine the physics of this battlefield. First and foremost, we have to recognize what KUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, actually is. It is not a concession that America graciously and charitably extends to its northern neighbor out of the goodness of its heart. It is not a favor. It is not foreign aid. It is a dense, intricate legal and economic infrastructure that underpins the single most integrated bilateral trading relationship on the face of the earth. It is a relationship so deeply woven into the DNA of both economies that trying to disentangle it would be like trying to separate the coffee from the milk after it has been poured. It would require dismantling massive automobile factories piece by piece. It would require physically rerouting continental energy infrastructure, fundamentally restructuring agricultural supply chains that have existed for generations, and absorbing consumer price shocks of a magnitude that no elected government on either side of the border could ever hope to politically survive. Consider the numbers for a moment because the numbers tell the true story. 20% of Canada and APO's entire gross domestic product crosses the American border annually. Canada supplies nearly 2/3 of all United States crude oil imports by volume. Canadian steel and aluminum are the lifeblood feeding American construction projects, American defense contractors building the weapons of tomorrow, and American industrial manufacturers. The auto parts forged in Canada are seamlessly embedded inside the vehicles assembled by American workers in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. The structural dependency runs fiercely in both directions, and it runs incredibly deep. Yet, the American political establishment was operating on a deeply flawed, almost arrogant assumption. They believed that asymmetry of scale automatically equals asymmetry of power. Because the American market is vastly larger, they spent 18 months projecting a narrative that the dependency only ran one way. They convinced themselves that America held all the cards and Canada held nothing but a begging bowl. This brings us to the grand illusion of the July 1st deadline. This is where the narrative manipulation becomes truly fascinating. Because the White House had been deliberately and strategically obscuring a vital legal detail from the public. If you read the precise, unglamorous text of the agreement itself, July 1st, 2026, is not a termination date. It is not an expiration. It is not the cliff they promised on television. It is merely a decision point. It is a legal junction at which the three signatory parties must signal one of three potential outcomes. They can renew the deal for 16 years. They can withdraw from it entirely, which requires 6 months of formal advance notice and, crucially, still leaves the deal in full force during that entire bleeding period. Or they can signal both non-renewal and non-withdrawal. And what happens if they choose that third option? It triggers an annual review mechanism that keeps the entire agreement in force, legally binding, fully enforceable, and protecting all existing trade exemptions, continuously, all the way to the year 2036. Let that sink in. The so-called deadline, the terrifying countdown clock that the administration was using to terrorize the markets, was actually just a gateway to a prolonged, decade-long negotiation. It was not a detonation. Political risk analysts at the Eurasia Group had already spotted this dynamic in their top risks analysis, describing the agreement as being poised to stagger on as a, quote, zombie agreement, quote, neither fully dead nor fully alive but functionally protecting trade nonetheless. The coercion, therefore, was a performance. The leverage was entirely manufactured for the cameras. And the quiet truth was that Canada and APO's negotiators understood the contract fundamentally better than the people who were threatening to tear it up on national television. But the tariff campaign itself was indeed brutal, and it was designed to be decisive when it launched in early 2025. A 25% levy on most Canadian imports and a 10% rate on energy products. The stated rationale, the spin for the evening news, was border security and stopping the flow of fentanyl. But the actual, undeniable mechanics were pure economic compression. The expectation in Washington was absolute. Canada, heavily reliant on the U.S. market, would buckle and break within a matter of weeks. Canada did not break. Instead, Canada retaliated. They struck back with $30 billion in counter-tariffs almost immediately, and then escalated that to a staggering $155 billion in retaliatory measures within just 3 weeks. And they did not just throw darts at a board. They targeted American agricultural exporters, American consumer goods manufacturers, and American industrial producers with a cold, surgical precision that was anything but accidental. They knew exactly which political districts to squeeze. Additional tariffs followed on automobiles, steel, and aluminum. The economic pain was undeniably real. The Bank of Canada had to move into a defensive posture. Canadian gross domestic product contracted under the suffocating weight of the levies. Economists estimated that the tariff cycle had already carved up to 2% right out of the Canadian GDP. Everyday Canadian households, people just trying to pay their mortgages and buy groceries, were absorbing up to $2,000 in additional annual costs. The industrial heartlands of Ontario and Quebec were taking devastating hits, with effective tariff rates on American-bound exports exceeding 6%. The damage was documented, it was measurable, and it was painful. By every conventional metric of a geopolitical coercion campaign, the pressure was working beautifully. Except it wasn't working at all. Because while the mainstream headlines were diligently and somewhat breathlessly tracking the visible damage to the Canadian economy, a quiet, irreversible, and monumental reorientation was accelerating just beneath the surface of every single trade data report and every corporate quarterly filing. In the 12 months leading up to early 2026, something miraculous happened. Canadian merchandise exports to non-American economies surged by a massive 17% year-over-year. Simultaneously, as if on a seesaw, exports to the United States fell by 10%. Canadian firms, operating with extraordinary agility across 27 separate trading partners simultaneously, had already recovered nearly $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in annual export revenue that had been lost to the American trade war. Canadian businesses were not sitting around waiting for a savior. They were rotating their export markets faster than most Wall Street analysts had believed was structurally possible. The federal government in Ottawa announced a budget with the explicit, audacious objective of doubling non-American exports by 2035, backing it up with massive new infrastructure investments and fast-tracked approvals for major industrial projects. And then, in a move that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, Mark Carney flew to Beijing. He secured a preliminary bilateral agreement with China, reducing Canadian tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for Beijing completely dropping tariffs on Canadian canola oil and suspending levies on a host of other agricultural exports. The Canadian supply chain was not merely absorbing the pain of the American tariffs. It was actively rerouting, deliberately, permanently, every single new long-term contract signed with a European buyer in Germany or France was a ratchet clicking forward. Every grain deal inked with an Asian importer was a ratchet clicking. Every energy agreement structured with a non-American refinery was a ratchet clicking. And as anyone in mechanics will tell you, a ratchet does not click backward. And then came the climax. The move that Washington and Oppo's entire strategic framework, built on hubris and volume, had entirely failed to anticipate. In the spring of 2026, the American administration sent signals through back channels and media leaks that it expected Canada to pay what insiders described as an, in quote, entry fee, end quote. They wanted a package of preemptive, humiliating concessions from Canada just to be granted the basic privilege of sitting down at the negotiating table as an equal party. Mark Carney did something that violated every single assumption the White House pressure model had been built upon. He flatly refused. He did not offer a polite counterproposal. He did not float a softened alternative to preserve the appearance of engagement while diluting the substance of the demand. He delivered a direct, institutional, and publicly stated refusal. When asked by reporters whether Canada should make additional concessions just to access the trade talks, Carney's answer landed in a single, devastating syllable. It was delivered with the eerie calm of a man who had already memorized every single clause of the agreement being weaponized against him. Ikuot, no ikuot. He then proceeded to tell the press corps, using precise, unembellished, almost surgical language, that the United States alone would not dictate the terms of whatever agreement was reached. He reminded them that this process was a negotiation, and that it would inherently require movement and compromise from the American side as well. Canada had not stormed out of the room in a fit of rage. Canada had simply declined, without drama and without a hint of apology, to enter a room that had been architecturally designed for its own subordination. The counterstrike was already deployed before Carney even finished his press conference. While the United States and Mexico were busy running their bilateral rounds, constructing what analysts thought would be a framework to isolate Canada, the Canadian Trade Minister sent a formal, written letter to the United States Trade Representative and Mexico's Economy Secretary. The letter was a masterpiece of institutional defiance. It recommended simply renewing the existing agreement for the full 16-year period. No annual review mechanism triggered. No renegotiation framework opened. No entry fee tendered. No preemptive concessions offered. The letter was devastating in its implication. Canada was not refusing to negotiate. Canada was calmly proposing to simply continue living under the deal that already existed. The deal that already governed $700 billion in trade. The deal that remained in legal force until 2036, regardless of the theatrical July 1st deadline. Canada had effectively looked Washington in the eye and communicated the one thing the entire maximum pressure campaign had been designed to prevent them from saying, end quote, "We are perfectly comfortable with the agreement as it stands," end quote. Now, to truly grasp the magnitude of what just happened, we have to bring in Warren Buffett. The Oracle of Omaha has been explaining the mechanics of this exact type of confrontation, albeit in different language, for over 4 decades. And the way this trade war maps onto Buffett's framework is almost uncomfortably precise. If Buffett were analyzing the situation, he would introduce what he calls the, end quote, hostage paradox. End quote. The hostage paradox dictates that the moment the party wielding coercive leverage makes the consequences of refusal explicit and public, they have essentially disclosed the ceiling of their power. They have handed their counterpart a map of the worst-case scenario. When the American president announced publicly that Canada could face a permanent tariff wall and no negotiation, he thought he was projecting unstoppable strength. In reality, he was announcing his maximum outcome. He disclosed that the absolute worst thing that could happen to Canada was a permanent tariff. But Canada had already spent 14 agonizing but productive months structurally adapting to absorb exactly that. They had offset it through trade diversion, challenged it legally, and reoriented their economy. The threat, once made explicit in the glaring light of public theater, transformed from an escalating weapon of terror into a known, manageable ceiling. As Buffett would say in his unhurried Midwestern drawl, the most dangerous thing you can do in any negotiation is tell the other party exactly what your best move looks like, because now they only have to figure out how to survive that one specific thing. Then Buffett would introduce the, end quote, structural void principle. End quote. When a massive, dominant market actor like the United States weaponizes its position as a buyer, it does not merely inflict financial pain on the seller. It engineers a strategic void, creates a reliable, widening absence of stable commerce. And what happens to a void? Competing buyers, alternative frameworks, and hungry new trading architectures rush in to fill it at a velocity that the original aggressor almost always underestimates. That 17% surge in Canadian exports to non-American markets? That is not a cute diplomatic gesture. It is not a temporary band-aid, and it is certainly not a signaling tactic for the negotiating table. It is a structural void being filled in real time. And once it fills permanently. Every single new trade relationship that Canada builds in Europe or Asia, while Washington is distracted with its performance of leverage, is a relationship that requires absolutely zero American permission to maintain. It is a relationship that generates cold, hard revenue completely independent of the chaotic American political cycle. It is a relationship that deepens with every single financial quarter that the American market continues to act unreliably. Those 27 new trading partnerships represent distribution channels, customer relationships, logistics infrastructures, and currency exposures that simply did not exist before the White House decided to make Canadian access to the American market feel uncertain. The void is filling, the velocity is increasing, and once a structural economic void is filled, it does not politely empty itself just because Washington suddenly asks it to. Finally, Buffett would close his analysis with what he calls the, end quote, reliability premium. And, quote, he would explain that in the grand casino of global trade, the most valuable thing any partner can offer is not the lowest price and it is not the highest volume. It is predictability. The country that can be counted on to honor the terms of its complex agreements. The country that refuses to detonate a multinational framework just because domestic polling numbers demand a temporary distraction. The country that does not sever vital negotiations over a petty television advertisement. That country commands a massive and quote, reliability premium and quote, in every single room it enters for the rest of history. Canada just spent 14 grueling months demonstrating to the entire globe, under maximum, highly publicized duress, that it holds its positions and honors its structure when squeezed. That is a reputation that compounds over time. And like all compounding assets, its true value ISN and OPPOs, T fully visible in a single quarter and OPPOs, S earnings report, it becomes visible across decades. And while Canada was busy compounding its global reputation, we must look at what the numbers were doing to the American side of the ledger. Because the blowback from this performance of power was not a theoretical concept discussed in economic seminars. It was tangible, it was measurable, it was bilateral, and it was accelerating, landing squarely on the very constituencies that the architects of the trade war had arrogantly assured the White House would remain perfectly insulated. Let us talk about the American agricultural sector. Exporters operating in the Canadian market suddenly found themselves staring down the barrel of counter-tariffs on billions of dollars of goods. American farmers across the Midwest and the Great Plains, people who had reliably exported commodities into Canada under zero-tariff conditions for 30 years, were now absorbing retaliatory levies that decimated their profit margins, right in the middle of a period of already strained agricultural profitability. Look at the American automotive industry. It is structurally and irreversibly integrated with Canadian parts manufacturing across the entire Ontario-Michigan industrial corridor. Suddenly, this sector absorbed a tariff exposure so severe that giants like General Motors cited it explicitly as a key, terrifying risk variable in their financial forecasts. This wasn't an OPPOs, T just numbers on a page. This translated directly into suppressed capital expenditure, delayed hiring decisions for American workers, and slashed earnings projections across the entire sector. The S&AMP wink with tongue sticking out 500, the bellwether of American economic health, took repeated, violent volatility shocks. The escalation cycles of the trade war compressed corporate earnings guidance across manufacturing, materials, energy, and industrial sectors. Analysts began describing the cascade effect as structurally uncontainable from within the equity markets. American construction companies, already struggling, faced sustained cost inflation as Canadian lumber and materials tariffs pushed input prices into the stratosphere. This actively delayed residential development across more than a dozen states, suffocating housing supply in an environment that was already suffering from a structural deficit of new homes. A deficit so severe it was registering as a domestic political crisis. And then there is the energy sector. American refineries, heavily dependent on Canadian crude, were suddenly forced to price in supply uncertainty for the first time in 3 decades. This risk premium did not stay contained within the energy sector. It flowed directly, immediately, and painfully into American consumer fuel costs, hitting every single driver at every single pump in every state that ran on that continental supply infrastructure. The broader American consumer, the everyday person, was completely exposed. The tariff cycle pushed estimated household costs higher across a vast array of imported goods, from the lumber building their homes to the steel in their appliances to the components in their cars. And this inflationary pressure arrived at the exact catastrophic moment when the Federal Reserve was desperately trying to bring domestic consumer price growth under control. The coercion that was explicitly designed to discipline Canada was instead metastasizing through the American domestic economy like a virus that the models had completely failed to predict, and that the political communication teams were entirely failing to explain away. And as if the economic blowback wasn't an OPPOs. Enough, the American legal system itself stepped in and dismantled the very scaffolding of the pressure campaign. In early 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a ruling that struck down several of the sweeping emergency tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The highest court in the land ruled that the executive branch had vastly exceeded its statutory authority. The legal architecture of the coercion campaign was declared unconstitutional from within the American judicial framework itself. The strategy didn't and OPPOs T just failed geopolitically on the world stage. It detonated structurally from the inside, dismantled by its own country and Oppo's highest court. The ratchet had clicked in the opposite direction, and it was never clicking back. What we witnessed in the North American trade corridor between February 2025 and June 2026 is a precise, clinical, and breathtaking demonstration of what actual structural power looks like when it resolutely refuses to be baited into performing weakness. The American administration arrived loud. It arrived with numbers meticulously calculated to overwhelm any rational resistance. It arrived with a ticking countdown clock, a public ultimatum, and a career-long reputation for making institutional counterparts flinch under the lights. It detonated the established, peaceful framework of North American trade relations with a supreme confidence built entirely on the fatally flawed assumption that scale asymmetry alone would compress Canadian decision-making into eventual, humiliating capitulation. They were not wrong about the asymmetry. The United States is vastly larger. But they were catastrophically, historically wrong about what Canada had been quietly, methodically engineering with the gift of time that the asymmetry had provided. Because while Washington was holding raucous press conferences boasting about leverage, Canada was diligently restructuring its entire export architecture across 27 global markets simultaneously. While the American administration was severing vital talks over a trivial provincial television advertisement, the Canadian leadership was boarding a plane to Beijing to secure the future. While American negotiators were running highly publicized bilateral rounds with Mexico and loudly announcing that Canada was falling behind, Canada and Oppo's chief negotiator was quietly on the record stating their objective with lethal clarity: the lowest possible tariffs on the narrowest basket of goods with the most market access for Canadian products. That is not a diplomatic platitude. That is a sentence so precisely calibrated it functions less like a negotiating position and more like the specifications for a weapon. The reality remains immutable. KUSMA does not expire on July 1, 2026. The trade relationship does not magically terminate. The legal protections that businesses rely on do not dissolve into thin air. The Canadian dollar has priced in the uncertainty and it has held its ground. The billions of dollars in recovered export revenue across all those non-American trading partners represent permanent market penetration. It is penetration that no subsequent American administration, no matter who sits in the Oval Office, can magically reverse with a single policy announcement or a stroke of a pen. The supply chains that have been rerouted over the Atlantic and the Pacific are not returning to the status quo. The massive infrastructure investments pouring into non-American trade corridors are multi-decade capital commitments. They have already been made, they have already been funded, and they are already producing tangible returns. Canada sent a calm, legally binding letter recommending a simple 16-year renewal of the deal that already exists. A deal on terms that inherently protect Canadian economic interests, requiring no entry fee, offering no preemptive concessions, and accepting absolutely no subordination. The message resounds globally. The Americans alone will not dictate the terms. There is a profound lesson hidden inside this narrative that extends far, far beyond the specific dry clauses of a North American trade agreement. It extends far beyond the particular, outsized personalities of the men who were fighting over it. It is the exact same lesson that surfaces time and time again in every asymmetric confrontation between a party that merely performs power and a party that actually engineers it. The party that performs power operates on volume. It announces its moves loudly to the press. It builds spectacle, creates artificial countdowns. It spends its energy telling the other side exactly what terrible things will happen if they refuse to submit. The party that engineers power does the exact opposite. It works quietly, methodically, without fanfare or grand announcements. It systematically reduces the cost of its own refusal. It builds alternative bridges so that the aggressor and Oppo's threat is no longer a devastating weapon that dictates the final outcome, but merely a weather condition. A storm to be modeled, adapted to, absorbed into the foundation, and ultimately outlasted. They came looking for a trade war, expecting a swift surrender. Mark Carney and Canada came to the battlefield with a complete structural reorientation of the Canadian export economy. They came with a polite formal letter proposing the continuation of the existing deal. They came with a massive 17% surge in non-American export revenues. They came with a brand new bilateral framework with the world and Oppo's second largest economy. They came armed with a Supreme Court ruling from the aggressor and Oppo's own country that dismantled the legal scaffolding of the entire tariff regime. And perhaps most powerfully, they came with 7 simple words, delivered without theater, without anger, without pounding on a podium, and without a single raised voice. End quote. The Americans alone will not dictate the terms. End quote. Because at the end of the day, power is not maintained by volume. It is not maintained by who can scream the loudest on a broadcast. It is maintained by architecture. It is maintained by structure, by reliability, and by the quiet, clicking ratchet of progress. And Canada just showed the entire world, and everyone listening right now, exactly what an unbreakable architecture looks like when it is tested under maximum, relentless pressure. That is all for today and Oppo's deep dive on Daily Gossip. It is a lot to process, I know, but these are the structural shifts that dictate the future of our global economy. If you found this breakdown valuable, if it helped you see past the political theater and understand the real mechanics of global power, please do hit that subscribe button. We rely on your support to keep bringing you these unfiltered, in-depth analyses. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and keep your eyes open, because the world is changing, not through loud declarations, but through quiet architecture. Until next time, stay sharp.